commanding heights over 700 meters above sea level, were held by elements of the Jermak battalion of the PLO's Castel Brigade. Held by only 75 men, they thought it impregnable, just as the Crusaders had found 8 centuries earlier. From there, the PLO could see Sidon in the west and Galilee in the south, targets for the artillery barrages they called down from these dugouts. It was taken during the second night by 200 men of the elite Golani Brigade in 2 hours of hand-to-hand fighting, echoing its capture by the Allies during the Second World War. Next day, it was handed over to Israel's southern Lebanon ally, Major Saad Haddad, and his Free Lebanese forces. They too had been targets of the PLO artillery directed from Beaufort Heights. A few Golani heard Major Haddad explain his reasons for welcoming the Israeli invasion.
And the Lebanese people was in bad situation, in lamentable situation, wanting to get rid of the occupying forces, but was not able to do it alone. And I used always to say that Lebanon needs a miracle to be saved, and this miracle happened now. And thank you very much.
But Beaufort Castle also commanded the way north to the strategic bridges over the Litani River and the Bekaa Valley. With that strong point taken, remaining Palestinian opposition melted away to reinforce those occupying western Beirut 50 kilometers further north. To the east, Battle Group H, infantry and armored battle groups from the 252nd Division, moved on Fatahland, the PLO guerrilla base near the Syrian border. Its 1,500 defenders from the PLO's Karami Brigade withdrew without a fight. The Israelis quickly crossed the Litani River to concentrate their firepower on PLO targets around Nabatea. Limited by terrain, tanks and mortars were used to harass PLO communications, ammunition dumps, and fuel depots. Nabatea, a major PLO stronghold, was taken with little fighting, and the 62-ton Merkava, or chariot tanks, that moved in unopposed, were an Israeli design that would turn the tank battles to come further north. With the big guns unable to play a decisive role in assaulting PLO infantry positions, they were taken in a fire and movement manner more typical of the Korean War. And the armored infantry of the 36th Division rolled quickly through Nabatea and on towards a series of major encounters with the Syrians. By evening that second day, and as the prisoners were brought in, the PLO's Jermak battalion had ceased to operate as an organized military force. As the Israelis pressed north, their aim of pushing hostile forces out of range of their border made confrontation with the Syrian army inevitable. It took the form of a series of armored battles and one of the biggest dogfights in the history of air warfare as the Israelis advanced into the Bekaa Valley. Syrian infantry emplacements at the southern end of the valley had been reinforced by their 91st Armored Brigade within a couple of days of the outbreak of fighting. A farming area, its terrain made concealment easy and allowed wide fire cover from surrounding mountain slopes. And 30 kilometers to the rear, the Syrian SAM missile sites threatened the air cover the Israelis needed for a major tank assault. The battle was joined, however, on the floor of the Bekaa Valley, north of Lake Karun. This first significant armored battle of the war saw Israel's Merkava tanks engage the Syrian 82nd Tank Brigade, whose brand new Soviet T-72 battle tanks were thought invincible. The Merkava's squat turret and front-mounted engine afforded its crew high protection. Only one was wounded. With its 105mm gun, it had been designed specifically to take on the Syrians in mountainous areas, and enemy tanks could be engaged up to 2 kilometers away by using its laser rangefinder. Despite Syrian deployment of their Gazelle anti-tank helicopters armed with wire-guided missiles, the Merkavas destroyed 9 T-72s in fierce fighting. Knocked-out tanks littered the battlefield after a victory made possible by the most significant act of this campaign, the destruction of the Syrian surface-to-air missile sites, which had dominated the Bekaa Valley since 1981 and had recently been reinforced. was made possible by reconnaissance using the remote-controlled drone spy plane, the Scout remote pilotless vehicle with its highly sensitive movie camera mounted underneath. Catapulted from a mobile ramp, it beamed back live pictures of ground activity, enabling Israeli jets to be directed accurately onto their targets. Guided by remote control, lens magnification produced clear pictures of enemy movements, observing individual soldiers as well as fast-moving tanks. It meant that had this drone been spotted, enemy reaction would have been monitored by its cameras. In the event, operators believed it was never detected, remaining airborne for up to 7 hours at a stretch over the missile sites, which had already been in action earlier in the fighting. Israeli jets directed onto the sites used smart bombs, which locked onto the missile system's own radar to guarantee hitting them. 17 batteries were destroyed and the other 2 put out of action without loss. This brought the Syrian Air Force into the fighting, and a major air battle began, involving 100 aircraft from each side in dogfights over 2 days. The Eagle of the Sky, the F-15 Interceptor, spearheaded the Israeli squadrons and quickly proved its superiority. In the first 3 hours, 29 Syrian MiGs were destroyed, again without Israeli loss. More were lost to their own SAM missiles before the Israelis neutralized them. This pilot, you can just see him in the haze, managed to parachute to safety in the hills. Next day, the Syrians again challenged the Israeli Air Force as it provided cover. They lost another 35 MiGs, bringing their total aircraft losses to 71, and effectively putting the Syrian Air Force out of the war. That enabled the Israelis' Cobra anti-tank helicopters to join battle, tipping the odds further in favor of Israeli armor as it moved forward to face the Syrians' 3rd Armored Division. They would do battle for control of the Beirut-Damascus highway as it passed through the Shuf Mountains. By now, Israeli objectives, as on the coast, had shifted. And while their armor pressed into strategic positions overlooking the potential battlefields, self-propelled guns pounded PLO positions in towns along the highway. Targets were pinpointed, towns like Jamor and Aria, straddling the main road into Beirut, as the artillery sought out PLO positions and lines of communication. The Syrians had reinforced the remnants of their 3rd Armored Division, but lost over 50 tanks in a series of battles among the fortified villages, often along the highway itself. Then, once again, the armored infantry moved up to take over the newly won positions. On foot, they carried out classic house-to-house sweeps to clear any further resistance from either Syrians or PLO. At one point, they took me into private houses in the middle of residential areas, which had been used to store ammunition, complaining bitterly the PLO were using civilians as a shield to hide behind. Hidden tunnels proved to be massive stores of ammunition, boxes of bullets, mines, shells, grenades, and even rockets stacked to the ceiling.
The other boxes are TNT, ammunitions, landmines. This one is Russian.
Yes.
And outside, the tanks lined up, leveling their guns on Beirut itself. After agreeing a ceasefire with the Syrians, the Israelis now linked up with their Christian allies to the north, and encirclement of the Lebanese capital was complete. The war of attrition began. The Israelis had reached Beirut just 6 days after crossing the Lebanese border. But instead of moving in quickly to end the PLO presence there, they paused, allowing Yasser Arafat's men to dig in, thus setting the stage for the most bitter conflict of the war. Tracer shells homed in on suspected PLO positions. The artillery and tanks that had encircled the city aimed their fire at specific buildings thought to be centers of PLO defense, communications and operations. The bombardment was relentless and went on by day and by night, and flares used to locate targets previously pinpointed by air reconnaissance or spotters on the ground. Another dawn, and grim reminders of the night's fighting. Another ceasefire violation answered, disrupting international moves to bring peace and a PLO evacuation of the city. In a deeply dug, complex system of underground tunnels and basements, the PLO awaited a move by the Israelis to try and take their positions. The rocket-propelled grenades that had already inflicted significant casualties on Israeli armor were constantly at the ready as the men relaxed and went about more domestic tasks. Their exit was far to the rear, through tunnels that took them up to half a mile from the front line. Far from the impact of the big guns, new recruits received sniper training for the street battles that were thought inevitable. Using the Soviet Dragunov, regarded in the West as imprecise, they homed in on a recognized enemy. But success was variable. Anti-aircraft emplacements and an old T-3485 tank placed among housing emphasized that the PLO was still adhering to its living shield tactics, even if its men were fatalist.
On this side, waiting die. We don't afraid from die. We came here to die.
But the tragedy was still being visited on the more general population. Inevitably, civilians also suffered from the bombardments. And it was already impossible to tell new damage from that inflicted in the Civil War. From the corner of another residential area, PLO rockets seeked the artillery that had hounded them. Israeli casualties would top 350 dead and 2,200 wounded.